Greetings, class. This is Dr. Christopher Cook, and this lecture for career counseling will be looking at a couple of theories for career development that have their roots in constructivist theory. That is the person and environment perspective and the career construction theory, and we'll be looking at the way these two theories contribute to career development. First, we'll look at the person and environment perspective. You should recognize some of the traits and characteristics of person and environment perspective from systems theories. They both emerged from kind of the same theoretical cauldron, if you will. The person and environment perspective was a commonly adopted perspective of social workers. It has both similarities with both trait factor theories and developmental theories, so it will both take into consideration the traits of the work environment and the individual, and also recognize the systematic or the normal developmental processes that go into career development. With regards to systems theory, because individuals are primarily located and viewed in the context of their various environmental systems, we can see a lot of overlap between this person-environment approach and systems approaches. People don't change or develop in a vacuum, but rather they develop and change in these environmental contexts, and those contexts are also changing and developing. So we get some of the systematic loops and cycles that we see in this approach, just as we see in systems theories. The person-environment perspective emphasizes the view that not all client problems emerge from within the client, but may be a function of the person-environment experience. So the career development problems that people face could have to do with internal components and internal issues that an individual is wrestling with, but it could also be a function of the environment they're in, the context they're in, or some of the different relationships between different and various contexts, or the interaction between the client and the client's particularities and the career or organizational or developmental context. The environment is considered a separate and distinct entity to be taken into consideration. The environment that each individual lives in is changing, just like the person is changing. It evolves with time, or it changes over time. And even if the individual is not experiencing significant or clear or precise change, because the environment is changing, the interaction between the person and the environment can change. Person-environment perspective is developmentally based, but focuses on environmental systems as the context for development rather than universal developmental stages. And in the late 70s, Bronfenbrenner theorized 5 environmental systems that we want to look at. These environmental systems begin with the microsystem, and the microsystem is the immediate setting of the individual. The individual's direct environment with direct social interaction is what makes up this microsystem. The microsystem influences the individual, and the microsystem is also influenced by the individual. So this would include things like the immediate family, the individual's school context or work context, peer relationships, any context or any environmental system that the individual has direct contact with. The next system is the mesosystem, and the mesosystem is the set of interrelationships between two or more settings in the microsystem. The developing person becomes an active participant. So, for example, there will be relationships between these different microsystem settings, such as the family setting or the family context and the work context. And so the idea of the mesosystem, rather than it being kind of a system in and of itself, it's more like the set of interactions that occur as a result of the individual's location in each microsystem. So the individual can have things going on in the family system, arguments with an argument with a spouse, for example, or strained relationships with the child. And then that interaction between the individual and the microsystem can have an influence on other microsystems, like one's place of work. So if you're having difficulty in your spousal relations at home, then maybe you go into the office, and because you're distracted and because you're in not a good work headspace from that argument or that encounter with the spouse, then the work context is then affected. So one's relationships with their coworkers could be affected. One's job performance could be affected, so on and so forth. Next, you have the system of the exosystem. And the exosystem represents settings or contexts that the individual is not directly involved in, but there may be indirect influence. The individual may affect that setting indirectly, and that setting may have an indirect effect on the individual. So this would be things like friends of family, or other kinds of outside or secondary relationships. You could think of this as settings that are 1 degree removed from the individual. And those things can then come and have an effect on the individual. So, once again, if you have, for example, a boss in your place of employment who is having problems in his or her family, and then they come to work, the boss's family might be an exosystem, and that exosystem may have indirect influence on the individual that you're working with because of the impact that that exosystem has on the individual's boss. So it's 1 removed, and then also the individual can have an indirect impact on that family. So if the individual that you're working with is an employee that works hard and is putting in extra hours and makes the boss look really good, then maybe the boss goes home and is able to have some greater ego strength in order to repair with his family or something of that nature. So it's an indirect system that can influence the individual 1 or 2 degrees removed. And then you have the macro system, and the macro system is this system that this underlying kind of milieu of beliefs and ideology is pervasive in the overall system or the overall context that the individual is in. It runs through the microsystem and the exosystem, and it intertwines and interacts and integrates with the mesosystem, and just creates kind of this cultural dish that individuals find themselves in, the overall milieu that pervades every system. And so beliefs and ideologies are part of this macro system, and those beliefs and ideologies, as they have an impact and as they have an bearing on the individual, can create influence. And it's much harder for the individual to influence those things that are in the macro system because of the nature of kind of this milieu idea, this just larger social context. And then finally there is the chronosystem, and the idea of the chronosystem is just that these systems and these contexts that we find ourselves in, they change over time. And so it's taking account the reality of the fact that our contexts and our systems change, and therefore we can't expect things to be static from one moment or from one day or from one week or month to the next. So these changes in patterns of the environmental events and socio-historical conditions just are reflected in this idea of the chronosystem. The image that you see here is meant to be an illustration of how these different systems work together. You can see in the middle is the child or the individual, and then the microsystem is the immediate environment. Skip the mesosystem for a second. The exosystem is the indirect environment, and then the macrosystem represents the social and cultural values. And with those four levels, child, microsystem, exosystem, and macrosystem, you can see how this circular image here, an illustration of these concentric circles, seems to make sense. What isn't so clear is that the chronosystem doesn't represent another layer, and neither does the mesosystem. They both represent interactions or changes. And so in this next illustration, we see a little bit clearer image of how these things work together. This image is a little more complex, but I think it clarifies some things. You can see that time, or the chronosystem, is given a different dimension here. And so these all emerge through time. The individual microsystem, exosystem, and macrosystem emerge and change and evolve through time. And then here, this little layer in the middle between microsystem and exosystem represents how these different layers interact with each other. So the microsystem and the exosystem and the macrosystem may all interact with each other and in the individual through the mesosystem. And so that layer is just what we call the interactional patterns between these other four systems, the individual, micro, exo, and macro system. So I think this is a little clearer illustration, even though it's a little more complex. The person in environment perspective views all aspects of the person as a whole, just like with our basic understanding of systems theories. It takes a who and a where approach to thinking about the client in the context of career. Counselors search for causes of client concerns that have developed from a broad range of environmental interactions. And so this expands our understanding and our vision and our perspective of what can help and also interfere with the client's functioning. Human behavior, according to the person and in environment perspective, can only be understood in the context in which it occurs. And so in order to understand the context well, or the person well, the context has to be understood as well. And so these are all, again, fairly fundamental components of a systems approach. And so this should feel relatively familiar to you, or shouldn't feel unusually obscure based on what you've already learned about systems theory. The person in environment perspective and also career construction theory are both founded in the underlying worldview of constructivism. This was a philosophical reaction to the emphasis on objective empiricism that's found in modernism and positivism, and it emphasizes the experience rather than an objective knowledge or empirical reality. Knowledge in this approach is thought to be not learned or discovered, but rather constructed in the mind of the individual through his or her interaction with the world around him, or the world around her. That perspective or that interaction with the world is the medium through which knowledge is created in one's mind. And individuals are considered to be self-defined through their relationship and their interaction with their environment. An individual is considered to be an active participant in truth construction. So we can understand that there is a degree of universality to this. We all have situations that we found ourselves in that were altered based on the perspective that we've taken toward that situation. We have had times where, because we have had particular beliefs, those beliefs have served to change the environment around us through our actions and through our interactions with the world. It is a perspective that has some degree of merit, and for the purposes of career development, it's a view that can be really helpful when we're considering the whole context, the whole social context and cultural context that a person is in, and the way that they tell their story and the way that they write their story can have pretty significant impact on how and when and why people enter into the professions that they do and explore the particular extracurriculars or areas of interest that they explore. Some of the assumptions that come with this kind of a philosophical approach include, first, that everything is connected. Individuals cannot be separated from their environments. They cannot be isolated, but they must be understood in the context of their environment. A constructivist approach assumes that there are no absolutes. Human functioning cannot be reduced to laws or principles, and cause and effect cannot be inferred. There is, in this approach, or in this perspective, too much complexity and too little real evidence of cause and effect, particularly in complex systems. Just as a very simple example of this, some people are intelligent and they work really hard, and they pick a career or a field that should be productive for them or effective in as a place in which they can work, and yet, in spite of these things, still can fail to be successful in their endeavors. And then you can have other people who don't work very hard, don't don't make good decisions in terms of their career perspectives, and yet still somehow end up successful and financially well off, and that kind of thing. And so this is a very simplistic example of the idea that cause and effect really can't be directly inferred, and that absolutes don't stand. Another assumption is that human behavior must be contextualized to be understood. We've discussed this already. And then finally, the individual's subjective frame of reference is the only legitimate source of knowledge. So individuals define themselves and their environments as they interact. And this one can be one that's a little bit difficult for Christian counselors to accept and to come to terms with. And I think there are certainly some problems with this perspective that an individual's subjective frame of reference is the only legitimate source of knowledge. I think certainly does have some problems as a fundamental principle, and yet I don't think that that completely undermines the whole of the philosophy. There's still a lot of really useful parts of this constructivist approach that can be very helpful for a career counselor in particular. Briefly, there are some applications of constructivism to career counseling that can be useful to think about going forward. First of all, individual careers are constructed through unique learning experiences within the individual's ecological system. And this is certainly demonstrably the case, but it's also really helpful just to remember that the individual system is going to contribute just as much as the individual. And so people who have limitations on their experiences, that has profound effect on career choice. People who have limitations on their opportunities, that has a profound impact on people's career development and career choice. Additionally, with constructivism, in a constructivist perspective or frame of reference, counselors emphasize how the individual fits into the work role and how the work role fits into the individual's lifestyle. And I think that we've seen this become a more common perspective on people's relationship with career and their employment and their work, their occupational ventures. There was a time in United States culture where the expectation was basically nothing comes before the job. So, the employers would expect employees to be there when they're supposed to be there, no exceptions, very little opportunity for missing work due to things that are happening in one's personal life. Employees are expected to kind of give all for the job. And now we're seeing a time in history where people are more and more frequently saying, hey, how does this fit in with my own life? This is not just, job is not the only important thing. There's family, there's leisure, there are things that I want to do with my life, places that I want to explore, travel, all kinds of other things. How does this job fit into, or how does this occupational role fit into my lifestyle? And both of those things are important, and a constructivist may even say are equally important. Further, in the constructivist perspective, constructs and perspectives continually change throughout the lifespan, and so this is true for the person, the occupational context, the family context, and so you might see much more precedence given to season of life in career choice rather than just traits or development. You might see more emphasis given to just other aspects of the individual's life and context that change throughout the lifespan, whereas in other perspectives, maybe developmentally people are seen to change, but there's not as much understanding or emphasis placed on the fact that the person's context changes, the work context changes, families can change, neighborhoods, communities can change, and all of that can have a bearing on career choice and career satisfaction. And of course, in a constructivist perspective, the individual's personal agenda is paramount. And this one can be tricky to navigate in a variety of cultural contexts where the career counselor may have this perspective that the individual's personal agenda is most important, but the client himself or herself may think that their perspective is just part of a larger family or community perspective that needs to be considered. And this brings us to career construction theory, which I mentioned before. And this is developed by Mark Savickas in the early 2000s. This was an approach to career counseling that blended Super's developmental theory with Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems, and particularly in the context of the constructivist worldview, the postmodern worldview. Individuals are seen to create their own narratives and life stories through the development of self-concept in their environments over the lifespan, and this is the primary seedbed, one would say, for career development and career selection. Person and environment fit at one point in life may not imply a fit at another point in life, and so that's very similar to the person in environment approach. Career construction theory trades on that and builds on that. Before we look at some of the applications of a postmodern or constructivist worldview to career counseling, according to career construction theory, here are a few resources for you. The Career Construction Institute is committed to understanding and exploring career development, career selection, career satisfaction through this constructivist approach. And then Vocofer.com is another resource that offers a lot of different assessments and instruments that can be useful from this perspective. According to Savickas, there are quite a few augmentations for the enterprise of career counseling that can be drawn out of a postmodern or a constructivist worldview. The first of this is that in this perspective, there are no more experts. Career counselors unlearn their privileges, become cultural agents that seek to remove barriers that prevent individuals from speaking and acting for themselves. So people don't come to a career counselor because the career counselor is the expert. They come because the career counselor can help them to integrate and interact with the world in such a way that the individual client, himself or herself, can become the expert for his or her life. So there's a movement away from the view of the client as the problem and the counselors as the solution, to a view where the client and the counselor are working together to find individually tailored solutions for the client that are coming from the client's own sense of autonomy and empowerment. Second, the counselor looks for enabling rather than fit. And so this is a more of a movement away from the person-environment fit model, and more a move away from the modernist attempt to socialize individuals into mainstream culture, and more a movement into the individual taking responsibility and accountability and creating his or her own story or narrative that will enable him or her to find a place in a career in the world of work. So diversity is affirmed, and a person-environment fit model is augmented with an enabling approach that fosters the creation of his or her own life plan for the individual. A third augmentation is the approach of rewriting the grand narrative. So the positivist view or the modern view thought of this idea that there is this grand overarching narrative that anyone can kind of find their place in or plug into, that this grand narrative just needed to be further discovered and explored and understood. And the constructivist approach or the postmodern approach indicates that there is no one grand narrative that's suitable for all people. So rather than trying to find or discover the grand narrative, individuals replace that grand narrative with their own understanding of their own life roles, life structure, personal values, work values, and those individual perspectives take greater precedence. And so the grand narrative is abandoned for individual and personal narrative. And then fourth, career is personal. Work roles are not isolated from other life roles. Rather, they fit and they integrate together. The barrier between career counseling and personal counseling crumbles. And this is, in my view, very much a positive movement away from, isolating or siloing career counseling and personal counseling. Rather, the two become blended and integrated. And meaning making becomes more important than in the person environment fit. A relational development in process becomes central. And so as the career becomes more personal, one's ability to make meaning of one's life story becomes a big part of that whole career design and development and selection process. And it becomes really focused on the individual. And so it may be that the person doesn't need to fit in with their environment. It may be that the person being in a work context that is less suitable to their personality is actually more important in the grand narrative of the individual's grand narrative. And so if there's meaning making or there's reason or purpose for that incongruence between the person and the environment, that may be of more importance and take greater precedence than the fit itself. Fifth is that career development theory is not counseling theory. Theories about how people choose occupations and develop their careers replace career counseling theories from this approach. And the quest of discovery is replaced by the quest of invention and construction. So this is, again, very much dependent on the constructivist view that we're kind of creating our reality, we're creating ourselves, we're creating our context and our story. And so having somebody else's theory of how to do career counseling is replaced by the individual coming to their own conclusions. And then finally, stories are of greater importance than scores. And so there's a movement away from the reduction of individuals to sets of objective scores, like what you would find in the Strong Interest Inventory or the Myers-Briggs, and movement towards a hermeneutical approach that, again, is dependent upon stories and storytelling and retelling stories or recreating stories. And so a lot of the assessments are open-ended questions and narrative writing, and are very much move away from having these isolated individual questions where you do scoring and you kind of calculate a total score. So stories rather than scores are key. So that is going to bring this brief overview to a close. The person in environment perspective and career construction theory are two approaches that have a lot of similarities and can really help round out an overall view of how do we think about career development, career selection, career satisfaction, and can really complement if you take the time to integrate and think through these approaches, can really complement career development theory.